All right. Welcome, everybody. Happy Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we are talking about the on the scan. Um, and this is something that, as MSPs, vulnerability scanning is, I would say, one of these, love-hate relationships. I'm going to use that, Brian. And we're going to talk about how I think in some respects we've been taught as an industry to look at vulnerability scanning in a particular way. Um, and so let me share out my screen. I'm going to set the stage, do some introductions, and we'll get right on into it for today. So let me get my sharing. Okay, let me know. Can you guys see this? All right, Ryan, Brian.
Yeah,
Looks good.
yeah, looks good.
Okay, perfect. All right. So I'm joined today by Brian Blakely, Ryan Seymour. I'll let them introduce themselves momentarily. My name's Andrew Morgan. I'm the founder of Write a Boom. I was asked to be the moderator of today's session. I'm looking forward to this. And, again, this is something that I think done correctly can really transform not only the relationship you have with your client, but also uh, mitigate a bunch of risks that you may or may not know that you have within your MSAs. We'll get to that a little bit later. But let me start off with introductions. Brian, starting with you, and then I'll go over to Ryan.
Okay. Yeah, the Brian and Ryan thing could get a little confusing. So, Andrew, I think you said Brian, so I'm already blabbing, so I'll get to it. And again, thanks, Andrew, and hey, everyone. Brian Blakely here. Spent the better part of the last few decades building, leading, operationalizing security and compliance programs, and as a full-time CISO, an MSP owner operator, and as someone who's sat in a lot of boardrooms and executive leadership team meetings, translating technical risk into business decisions, right? And over the years, I've learned something important. The biggest vulnerability in many organizations isn't unpatched software. It's unaligned leadership. So my goal today is, along with Ryan, and thanks again, Andrew, my goal today is really to see if I can help bridge the gap, to show how we can translate these technical findings into business conversations that leadership can what? They can understand, they can react to and act on and fund and resource. So excited to be here today. It's a great topic to talk about.
Yeah, fantastic, Brian. Okay, Ryan, over to you. And getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm just wondering if maybe you guys, I don't know if you're close to your mics or what have you, but just be aware of that. But Ryan, over to you.
Yeah. So good to be here, Ryan Seymour, VP Consulting Education at ConnectSecure. So, been in the MSP industry for about 20 years now, serving the space, and I have held probably every position from technical to sales to service delivery, education, consulting, kind of all the aspects. And I think what I've seen over my career experience is that tools specifically aren't failing in organizations because of talent, but generally because lack of strategy, right? They generally don't have a great plan to go in those tools with. So today is going to be not about more scanning and more noise, which I'm sure none of the MSPs want to deal with, but how we can actually make security make sense. So, being a business risk translator and being able to talk to executive teams, board members, and other leaders that are not technical, I think is an art, one that I think Brian Blakely is very skilled at, if anybody has heard him before. So I'm happy and humbled to be here as part of the conversation, and something I'm very passionate about as well. So really excited to be here. And Andrew, thanks for hosting us.
Yeah, and both you and Ryan have said it a little bit differently as I lead into the agenda. Nothing happens if business owners and executives, whatever size business we're working with, understand it in their language. And that's the thing where, as MSPs, I see it's not a technical gap. It's not, it's not that we're failing in terms of being good at security or, the art of technology. I think, on the margin, MSPs are really good at, Brian. I think the problem on the margin is the fact that we are failing in terms of speaking something that they truly can understand, that means something in business terms, that makes them want to actually do something and take action, versus the wow, you've given me a lot to think about response. That's Brian Blakely. You've termed that probably the worst response you could possibly get, right?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't land and nobody understood a freaking word you said. That's what that translation is. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So I promise you all this won't be death by PowerPoint. I simply created a quick PowerPoint that I'm going to run through literally in about 60 to 120 seconds, just to kind of give you a vision of what we're going to talk about today. And it's going to be much more conversational, interactive, but I just want to paint a picture for everybody. I'm going to go through setting the stage, to today's topic. Really why I think we are in the place that we are in terms of vulnerability management and scanning. This does coincide a bit with security assessments. But from there, we're going to talk to Ryan, who has a really good data set now on MSP vulnerability management maturity. That's a lot to say, but we're going to talk about where this data set comes from. And it's pretty eye-opening because it's a decent sized data set. And the MSPs the data set come from the most mature, large MSPs all the way through. And we're starting to see some ubiquitous findings, synonymous findings, which the good news is through this, a lot of these boot camps that he's doing are changeable, and he's making a difference. I'm going to talk to both Brian and Ryan about the three critical components to vulnerability management success. We'll talk about, once we understand these three critical roadmaps, like how do you get going? What's the roadmap to get going? And then how we can help. So the setting the stage, I'm just going to keep this up here for a minute. I'm going to kind of joke around with Brian Blakely because I think he and I rival each other probably a few years, maybe one way or the other, of being in the space, the late 90s. But without going into naming names and tools, here's how I want to set the stage. Brian, vendors come into our space, and a lot of times we as MSPs, through their messaging, right, not our fault, right, in the 2010 to 2015 era, we saw that, by scanning environments and coming up with this big book of CVEs, right, that we could use this as a sales methodology. Really, hey, instead of going into your customer and having a conversation about X, Y, or Z, tell your prospect, hey, look, we'll go in and we'll do a free security assessment, and we'll show you all this stuff going on in your environment, really scary stuff. And it worked to a degree, Brian, and that's sometimes the setup for failure, right? In other words, we get some success, that, hey, I walk in with this big book of vulnerabilities and misconfigurations or what have you that these scanners provided, and this enablement package from a vendor, and voila, we get a customer. Now, it doesn't mean we got the customer at the right price. It doesn't mean that were set up for success with a vulnerability management program, but they did, and probably still a lot of the times, Ryan, you can speak to this, but I'm going to go to Ryan first. It's the initial reason an MSP will come and ask about to come to a vulnerability management company about sales. Hey, I need a sales tool. I need to show gaps. Your thoughts on that, Brian, as far as how maybe we as the industry have gotten trained?
Yeah, I think as an industry, right, we confuse tools and busyness and big gigantic reports with big strategy. And I think you could get away with that in the 2000 early 2000s that I'll call the clipboard IT tech, right? Before MSP really caught on a lot of momentum. But that sales tactic is stale. Clients are much better educated now. And if you think that you're going to use scanning as a strategy, I think we talked about this the other day. Scanning ain't a strategy, right? It's not. Most MSPs now have a really great tool stack, right? They run scans, produce these gigantic reports, send alerts, but none of it has leadership alignment. And those things are just, they're going to fall flat these days, right? And it's just really just a lot of activity, and you can't prove your value by shoving some 300-page list of vulnerabilities that business doesn't understand. They're not going to support or put any resources behind, right? Tools collect data, but leadership make decisions. Okay. And so that's been the disconnect, and why in large part, these big gigantic scans don't work, because until you connect those two things, collecting data and leadership decisions, right, you're not reducing risk. You're just kind of documenting a bunch of stuff they don't care about, right? Scanners surface findings, processes. We're going to talk about this today, right, Ryan? Scanners surface findings, processes determine priorities, right? And governance drives closure. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that North Star. But Andrew, again, scanning ain't no strategy, to use perfect English there. And we got to get beyond that. And I think that's what Ryan's really going to deep dive into, is on the defensibility of building what a real program looks like and its value to the business and driving business outcomes.
Yeah. And Ryan, I mean, that's where we're headed with what Brian just said, but true or false, still predominantly, I mean, you guys have thousands of customers, thousands of MSPs. Predominantly, the number one reason you'll initially get an intake, true or false, is around sales, is it not? You're on mute, I think, Ryan.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I muted so you didn't pick up that keyboard. I would definitely agree with that, Andrew. I think that more than half of the organizations that come through our front door and looking for a scanner, they're looking for a way to earn the business, as Brian and I like to dub it. They're looking for a way to earn new business. And using a vulnerability scanner, I think, as you guys have called out for the last decade, has been a low cost and a high impact way to come into an organization and say, hey, look, you've got all these problems. Let me help you. And I think it's worked for a while, but again, I think the market has risen, the education has risen. There's a lot more options out there now. And so I do think it's an old way of doing business, although it still is working in some traditional markets, right? I'm not saying don't do it, but you should be prepared for a more mature buyer, because I think we're seeing more of those in the market space now.
Yeah, cool. All right, last few pieces, and I'll get off the PowerPoint. So we're going to talk about findings from you, Ryan, on, you've done a lot of these boot camps, hundreds and hundreds of MSPs through them. We're going to talk about the key findings and the data that you've kind of gleaned from that. I'll pull, and like I said, I'll pull this down. I'm going to ask you and Brian to talk a lot about this, area of maturity, the ahas that you're seeing in terms of process and policy gaps, their lack of SOPs, but on the flip side, excitement about getting them and implementing them and the changes that they make. And like I said, I had to put in Brian's, this is my new favorite quote of the, I would say, of the week when I heard scanning ENA strategies, probably better said, from Brian. So those are the findings. And then, okay, great, we got these findings, but what do we do with that? How do we change it? And so we'll go through the three critical components, which Brian will kind of really dig into, which is engagement and alignment with leadership. It's one of my favorite subjects, and I can listen to Brian. I've heard him talk about this a lot, but the way in which he engages business and gets them on board with what he's doing when he's implementing a security program, and why they care and why they don't glaze over. And trust me, Brian, that's not through you've had your fair share of scars of doing it wrong. Is that fair? Over the
Oh my
years?
gosh. Yeah. The wisdom. I cringe at some of the stuff I did, even 5 years ago sometimes. Right. You live, you learn, you gain wisdom, and all those become learning experience. But I have failed miserably in front of big leadership teams. And you learn to say, hey, that didn't feel good. I don't want to do that again. What do I need to do differently? And so if we can share some of that wisdom along the way, I'd like to help other people avoid that pain if possible.
Yep. Absolutely. And then we'll go into Ryan is going to chat a lot about the defensibility and the strategy that he's come up with and that he's implementing and that you can take away. And then we'll come back about this reporting and feedback loop that on this initial engagement, right, that you got with them, Brian, that management's intent, how we viewed risk, what was most critical to drive revenue in the business. When you do find gaps and things that are meaningful, how you tie them back to what management said was most important in terms of driving the business forward. We'll close out with, how to get moving, your roadmap to success. And then, like I said, Ryan can talk about how we might be able to help you. So I'm going to stop sharing, come back to conversation. Ryan, I'm going to turn it to you. Hundreds and hundreds of organizations now. And again, every time I talk to you about this, I'm kind of like, I scratch my head because you started doing these boot camps that you charge for. First off, I'm like, really? People are going to, go through this? And I know you're awesome at what you do, but I was a little skeptical at first. And then, you get these classes with 50, 75, 100 people in them of all different shapes and sizes and maturities. Can you walk us through like the commonality and things that maybe struck you even as like, wow, there's a problem here that needs to be solved?
Yeah, most definitely. And just so those that may not be familiar with boot camp and what we're actually talking about, we built a boot camp training this year for our partners. And the goal was about creating education around what vulnerability management looks like. And we didn't really want to hone in and make it specific to our product. There are a lot of organizations out there that have multiple products for vulnerability management because it comes in different flavors. But we wanted to teach the proper way to really leverage a vulnerability management program, again, that creates a strategy out of a tool. So the boot camp has been, I would say, wildly successful. We were not expecting to get as much either. So when we saw the large number of people raising their hands, we were like, this is awesome. And again, the goal was to just educate our partner space about how to really leverage our platform to do proper vulnerability management. And so doing these over the last couple of months, we'll be coming up on our number 5 boot camp here in November. What I have seen across the data has been a pattern across the MSPs. And it's the same story, no matter if it's a newer MSP that is brand new to vulnerability management, they've never had a scanner and they're coming in for the first time. I've got partners that are on the other end that are, all the way at the highest level of compliance. They're dealing with DoD, they're dealing with CMMC, they're dealing with regulatory body and pressure. And then we've got some in the middle. right? And I think a lot of them fall in the middle somewhere on that spectrum, but the data was the same across them all. No formal operating procedures, no formal documentation to really define the strategy, the intent, and what we're supposed to be doing with the scanner, right? We know what we're supposed to do with the scanner. It's obvious, but like, what do we do with the scanner? When I run the scan, what am I supposed to be doing with it? And how do I make sure that leadership isn't disengaged because the data is not telling a story? And I'm more or less talking about all the technical jargon, right? CVEs and EPSS, and half the people don't even know what that stuff is. So we wanted to take a different approach to this and really lead with a strategy for partners, for organizations, a provable, defensible strategy. And when I say defensible, it's one of my favorite words. And what I mean by that is being able to prove your process and your intent. Not just having the scanner and the results, but actually having a formalized plan that's documented that includes a strategy of what to do with the scan results, and more importantly, how to communicate those results to the organizations. And again, learning from Brian, I think in our industry, he is an expert at doing that. And so we want to try to rise the tide of the entire MSP space and show everybody how to get away from the technical conversations more and more and really leverage a strategy. And again, we uncovered that wildly through the data as we talked to our bootcamp participants. One of the things we provide in that bootcamp are templates. So we provide organizations with a vulnerability management program and a policy and an operating procedure so that they're not reinventing the wheel. Because let's be honest, vulnerability management is not rocket science, right? It's one of the 20 things that these MSPs are managing. And so we wanted to make that easy and lead with a framework, lead with a best practice. And I think we've done a great job getting off to doing that. And so, we want to continue driving consistency, because consistency to me is what builds credibility, and building credibility is what gets MSPs further into those organizations, right? It's about becoming more than the IT guy now, because as I always say, cyber and security is not an IT problem, right? It's an entire organization problem. So I think this is starting to lay a foundation for organizations to realize that. And then it becomes, I think, infectious across other areas of their organization. When they learn this strategy, you can apply this to really any technical process. It's not just vulnerability management, but I'm thinking about the big three, right? Incident management, change management, use any word, management, and you need to have a strategy. Otherwise, again, you just have a bunch of people doing their best intentions. And when organizations grow large, we start to see drift. So
good. Really, really appreciate you sharing that. Brian, so, again, let's go and think about what Ryan just said. Most MSPs don't have a solid vulnerability management program, probably haven't discussed policy with their customers, haven't aligned it with most critical assets, et cetera, et cetera. That's what the findings are showing, because they're clamoring for, show me how to do it. Show me how to implement a standard operating procedure. Show me where I'm going to take you next is alignment and engagement with leadership. When we're starting off with it as a sales tool and say, look at all these problems, why are we in essence going down the wrong path? And then how do we correctly do that? How do you go in to an organization and start it where they're going to say, okay, Brian, when you do bring us this, I'm engaged now. So let's talk about the leadership and starting at the highest level, why you have to have status and why they're going to listen, what has to occur early on with the relationship.
Yeah, I think far too often we want to do this big scary scan and come in and use fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? That's what we want to do. We want to come in and show a big report and say, here's everything your current MSP sucks at. Here's everything we found. Look at all this stuff. And boy, if we do it differently. But you're going to sound like every other provider that goes in there and talks to them, right? So how can you be different? Let me tell you, you go in and before you start talking about scanning and results and all that stuff, it's not about you. So you think it's about you, but it's not. You go in and it's about the client. You really start to understand and dig into the client and how they operate, what's important to them, what their competitors are doing, what do they see as their biggest risks in their business, what are their most profitable revenue streams, do they have big client contracts, those kinds of things. And and sometimes it'll take them a little bit of time to understand, and someone will ask you, it's like, hey, no other MSP has ever asked us any of these questions. Why do you care? What are you talking about? Or why are you trying to pry into my business? And you could say, because I want to make sure that everything we do is going to be aligned to your goals and objectives of your business, what you're doing, what's important to you. I want to understand your business. I want to understand your fears. I want to get into your emotions a little bit. Then when I do my IT nerdy stuff and do my scans and I go back and talk to them, I don't talk to them like Ryan said in CVEs or EPSs or TTPs or any of those other TLAs, right? I don't do any of that. TLAs are 3-letter acronyms for those keeping track. So I don't have any of those when I go in, and I'm not speaking Klingon. I'm speaking in a voice and vernacular that not only that they understand, but it's specific to them and their environment. And folks, these are 10, 15-minute get to know you conversations that are more like a business intake, right? And so instead of going in with fear, uncertainty, and doubt in your scan results, I'm going in and I'm saying, 80% of your revenue you said comes from transaction processing fees. Well, I've got some concerns about some of the equipment and the gear, the stuff that runs those processes that drive that 80% of your revenue. There's some material things in there that I think that need addressed. Would you like to see a statement of work that we could do that address those things? Or would you like to see some of the packages or products that we have that I think can solve some of your problems and start to shrink risk over a period of time? Would you like to see that? That's a different conversation because I haven't taken some gigantic, look at these criticals and jump up and down and say, you really need to fix it and your current MSP sucks. That's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And at the same time, you're not being relevant and you're putting yourself into this IT nerd land instead of a business and risk
Brian,
advisor.
you also, I want people to hear this because again, a lot of times when you start asking about people's business and it is so different how you make money, talk to me about your revenue streams, talk to me about your largest customers, what kind of contractual obligations do you have? And they might start looking at you going, like you said, no one's ever asked me this stuff before.
Hey, dude, love it, because then you could say, hey, my job, why I'm trying to do this is I want to make sure you don't have to spend $1 more than you have to on security and compliance. This is about alignment. I've got a bunch of stuff over here that solves a bunch of problems, but I don't think you need all of it. But I don't know that until I better understand you and I better understand your risk and I better understand what you promised your clients and customers. And so that's part of what, we need to do a contract readiness assessment, right? All of these things kind of feed in. So when I'm doing my vulnerability scans, I'm connecting the dots to those critical business functions and those client contracts. What is no other MSPs having those conversations? And how impactful is that where you go in with your program and you say, you know what? Hey, I know, through our conversations, you're about a $10 million company. 80%, $8 million of revenue is at risk here. And I also reviewed this client contract that you have, that's $5 million a year. I need to put a program together because right now I have concerns that you're in breach of contract because there's contract provisions in there with your largest customer that talks about you're going to do these routine vulnerability scans. And did you know you also need to report those on an annual basis? Did you also know your clients have a right to audit you? And if they audit you, you're not doing these things. It says that you have all these policies and procedures and a vulnerability and patch management program, and you're not doing any of this stuff. We need to put this in place. Much more impactful than throwing a scan on.
It's a quick question. George in chat asks about if someone wanted to specialize in vulnerability management, Brian, what certifications should they pursue? So, there are obviously certifications out there in VM. A lot of the major manufacturers like Qualys, Tenable, et cetera, offer them. And even I think SANS does. Have you ever seen it no disrespect to anyone, does it make a difference? Have you ever seen, because you've you've played at the biggest, the big. You've got, you've been CISO of a $50 billion, financial transaction organization. Do they matter, quote unquote?
Yes and no, right? Is it going to impede your ability to sell? And is it going to be something executives even, it's probably just a few more initials after your name. It probably won't lend the right kind of credibility in most of our MSP client space. But what it does do is it shows operational proficiency on your technical team and how they're handling vulnerabilities and their ability to prioritize those and respond. So the velocity of findings to a business decision, I think you're operationally more sound. Will it be the difference between you getting work or not? Doubt.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it. Like, Brian, I mean, I'm going to pick on you kindly for a minute. I mean, if anybody goes out and looks at Brian Blakely on LinkedIn, you'll see, I mean, I don't know how many certifications you have, Brian. Has it ever 15, 20 certifications after your name? Has it ever been the reason you've won business, or has it more been the fact that you understand, you have like this conversation having right now about a business conversation, and the fact that you can, as a business owner who's owned many businesses, the fact that you're having conversations about what they care about, like, is that been more the grease that's solidified the relationship, or the 15 or 20 certifications you had after your
name? Yeah, certifications. I must be making up for something with all the certifications. I don't know what that is, but at the same time, that's just about growth mindset and the journey. That has zero credibility when you're talking to business leadership and the like. Where it carries the most weight and helps is when you are talking to larger enterprises and you're going to meet with their CISO or their vendor. They're doing, the risk nerds at the client sites are doing their risk assessment. And you want to show up and say, hey, I've got some experience, but I also have some credibility, especially in C-risk and CISO on the audit side and some of those kinds of things. But in a business discussion, it carries zero.
Okay. So in wrapping up, before we go to defensibility with Ryan, Mr. Blakely, where does it, you shared where it starts, why you're asking the questions, right? How do we then start to get into, hey, here's how we're going to start off the relationship, right? They're okay, this guy sounds different, right? He's asked about our business. Here's why we're going to do what we're going to do. How do you get into the relationship, where most MSPs want to, hey, we're going to scan your environment. We're going to do a security assessment, a gap analysis, and then we're going to come back, and do the boogeyman. Where do you gain alignment and moving forward?
Yeah, and we've talked about scanning and tools aren't the strategy, right? And really, Andrew, the next step is always taking some of your business intake, understanding what you know about the business, and then starting to put together that strategic roadmap, whether it's a 12-month, 36-month, whatever that is, where you can align out some tasks, milestones, and deliverables over that period of time, where you get mutual agreement, and then having, we're going to talk about a little bit later, the feedback loops and that kind of thing. But as it relates to, vulnerability management and building a program and strategy around that, I think I think at that point is you're defining a North Star together with your client and moving towards that. And we'll talk a little bit more about, I know when Ryan gets into the defensibility of the program, building policies and procedures, but it's really moving into, hey, we know about you. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what the journey looks like, and getting commitment and buy-in from there, Andrew. And I think, again, it's all about alignment. And I'd love to talk about what Ryan said too, is, building policies, building the SOPs, building the program. Really, you connect all those results back with the program into to the feedback loop, which I know Ryan is going to get to too. So I don't want to steal any thunder there, but no magic there. Build a strategic roadmap that makes sense to the business outcomes and business
Sounds
decisions.
good. Okay, so let's assume we've got alignment, agreement. This guy Blakely knows what he's talking about. He's going to come back with this. they're going to start to move forward. Okay, Ryan, you're sitting there now teaching, and you have these 50, 100 people that you train. Talk about the defensibility and the strategy portion of this. How do we go about it?
Yeah, so I think, again, everything Brian said, you can't skip that step, right? Because if you go to my step first, then you don't have the info you need. So I can't stress enough about that engagement of leadership. I think it really gives you the North Star. It gives you something to aim at. So getting engaged with leadership early on, I think, is important. So when that happens, I think as you start to talk about defensibility, right, this is building the proof. And I think it starts with a program that defines leadership's intent, right? We're going to talk about what is our intentions. Okay, you said you want to do vulnerability management. What does that mean to our organization? That we want to automatically scan for vulnerabilities. We're going to remediate them within 7 days if they're critical, 14 days if they're hot. Or we're going to define some parameters around it, right? We need to know, to Brian's point, what contractual obligations do I have? What did I tell my customer I was going to do? Right? What are we supposed to be doing? And I think that the program itself defines that, and it says specifically what the scope is, what the roles and responsibilities are. I've talked to so many organizations where nobody knows who's supposed to do what. They think they know, or you end up with multiple people doing the same things, but because they don't really have roles and responsibilities defined. So I think that defensibility comes into play is when we're actually building out that strategy, right?
And quick question about that. Why the strategy matters to what Brian has done. He's learned how they make money. He's learned what's most important. Can you talk to us when you're building that strategy? One, about critical assets, why Brian's leadership discussion mattered so much. So what's critical in the assets, the contractual obligations, the supply chain risk that we're seeing pervasively in the industry. And then even talk maybe a little bit about, I've given you a lot here. Last thing is a lot of times it's, oh my gosh, we have a 9.9 CVE, but a lot of times you could have a 5.6 CVE that's far more important to remediate. And so maybe talk about those things, about tying what Brian did and found out about the business to the program, because that's really where it meets the road, the rubber meets the road. And it also will shore up the last part, which is the feedback loop and reporting.
Yeah, good point. So when we talk about critical business assets, I always like to just boil that down. What does that really mean? It means protect what matters most, not to you, to the business. MSPs are really great at knowing what's important on infrastructure. We all know that firewalls are important. We all know that web servers on the internet are important. We know edge devices are important. We know VPNs are important, right? Stuff that we can get to. But then there's all this other stuff in the environment that isn't obvious to us from a scanner. And that's where those conversations that Brian's discussing, that's where we get that information from. The client tells us what assets in the environment, what functions in the environment are allowing them to deliver services that either drive revenue or drive customer success. I think those are the two business drivers that I've always seen. You're either doing revenue or you're doing customer success if you're like a nonprofit or education sector, et cetera, right?
Yeah, it's either the revenue or the
mission. Yeah, protect the mission. So it's all the same. But again, as an MSP, my job is to identify what technology are you using to drive those outcomes, right? And so that to me is our job as an MSP. And that's part of the defensibility build is we need to know what matters most to protect what matters most. And again, it's not always firewalls and servers, albeit those are important. We need to talk to our customers about those things, right? So we can tie back those specific functions and assets to the risk that we find, right? That's what starts to connect those dots together. Brian, you look like you want to come in on that with me.
I do. I'm just I'm passionate about this stuff. You know, I nerd out with you all day on this stuff. Love talking to both Ryan and Andrew. But I think once leadership is aligned, right? The next step in what you're talking about, Ryan, building defensibility, right? Creating that documented, repeatable, leadership-driven program that outlives any one tool, right? Let's face it, tools change, but leadership intent that you brought up doesn't change. That's what's memorialized in the policy you're talking about. So if your vulnerability strategy changes every time your scanner changes, you didn't have a strategy, you had a subscription, right? So defensibility, I think at the end of the day, means you can show what? You can show who owns the risk, not who runs the tool, who owns the risk. We talked about this a little yesterday. What thresholds trigger the action? And when leadership, when do we inform leadership, right? That's what gets auditors, insurers, that's what executives want to see, a consistent documented process that proves you're managing risk, not just finding it. And a simple flow I like to think about when it comes to defensibility: scan, triage, translate, treat, and tell. And tell, that last step, is where most of us screw up and stop short, right? We scan, we patch, we report, we send the glossy PDF to the client, right? But the story of why it matters never reaches leadership, right? The story you tell about risk is as important as the risk you fix. So clients, your clients' executives don't want to report. They want reassurance. I can tell you also, most leadership and boards, they don't like surprises. Okay. Nobody, I mean, not these kinds of surprises that we're talking about. They want fewer surprises. So when you can tie vulnerability to cash flow, uptime, client trust, customer contracts, that kind of things, you stop being a vendor and start being a risk, a risk partner. And one way, and I'll end here on the defensibility, but to frame this kind of like, from a business perspective, when I meet with leadership, Ryan said this too, you don't talk in CV or exploit kits, right? You say, we need to invest 10 grand, right? It's as simple as this. Hey, Joe, Brian here. Yeah. Looking at everything and want to talk to you for a minute. We need to invest 10 grand to protect $1 million in revenue, right? The outdated SSL VPN could expose your client contracts worth 7 figures, right? It's the same issue technically, but it's framed in a way that your clients, decision makers, right, can act on it, right? Risk doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the revenue streams at your clients. So when you map vulnerabilities to those streams, like Ryan's talking about, the business case builds
itself. It's the same reason. Chime in, Brian. It's the same reason. It's a whole different subject. But when your MSP comes to you, and I've had this happen many times, says, hey, remember that customer that wasn't regulated that I've been trying to get from 150 to 225 a seat, and they push back, even though I noted they needed all these things, push back for the last year, would never do it, and all of a sudden is ready to spend the money. They didn't have the budget for, we didn't have the money. What happened? Why all of a sudden do they want to do it immediately? Oh, it's because their 7-figure, their largest customer, pushed down a security audit that said, hey, if you're not doing these things, we have to leave you.
But that's the psychology of it, though, right? It's tangible because the clients understand it. The boss at your client has this $10 million contract in his hand, and his client saying, hey, you can't do it. Or I'm trying to sell the next $10 million to this client, and the client's risk nerds are pushing on your customers with this gigantic security questionnaire and all this stuff and all these contractual provisions in there to do all this stuff. Now suddenly they can connect the dots. So maybe you can be more proactive in how you're addressing the client, business intake on the client, the questions you're asking the client. Tease that out up front, because I can guarantee you your customers have signed all kinds of agreements with their clients and agreed to all kinds of stuff because they wanted the money, right? They understand that, hey, I signed this contract, I get the money, but they need educated. It's incumbent upon us to educate our clients to know what's in those contracts and what that really means, and that they're in breach and they're putting that revenue tied to that contract at risk. They can understand that. Now they're regulated. I've never met an unregulated client.
Yeah, I love
Never.
that statement. So, you know, in interest of time, Ryan, can I jump to reporting and feedback loop?
Yeah, I think I want to close with a 30-second here and say, when you talk about defensibility, I think the other really important factor that you want to make sure you're thinking about is prioritization, right? How are you prioritizing what you're actually going to fix? It's easy to scan stuff, right? Scanning is almost automated these days. There's very little effort in running the scans. It's really about what do you do when you get the findings back, because every environment I've ever scanned, there's hundreds or thousands of things that get detected, and you just can't fix them all at once. So my message would be, when you get into this strategy, you really need to think about prioritization. And I think that's where this business impact analysis becomes important, because again, MSPs have this really bad habit. They love to chase around criticals and highs in red. They'll chase around critical high, anything critical high, we're going to solve it now. To your point, I have many examples this year. We've seen it. We call them chained vulnerabilities. You can have two lows, two mediums, a low and a medium and two lows that get chained together, and they create critical exploits. Some of the exploits we saw this year, including the MOVEit exploit, used two mediums and a low CVE. So if you're an MSP chasing around criticals and highs, you missed that. And again, so when we think about prioritization, I think the number one priority should be critical business assets that you've aligned with leadership, that they understand. And then it's the traditional scoring telemetry. Then we'll look at severity, exploitability, and some of the threat intel that we get from the community. But to me, it's got to be the customer's prioritization, protect what matters most.
Oh, and Ryan just did an excellent job, by the way, too, Andrew, of connecting the dots back to the certification question. You know, that chaining of vulnerabilities. If you have somebody that's certified in the tool, gone through a boot camp or extended training within a tool, they have that knowledge and can identify those kinds of things. So that was a brilliant connection Ryan did to the certification.
Yeah,
question.
and George, I'm glad he said, hey, I'm going to get one certification and focus his energy on developing skills around the business. So
that's a skill.
That's
a skill.
That to me is a win. Brian, before we move into, I'm going to tee up, reporting and feedback loop. But one thing I think we also forget about in our, scanning and, posture management or all these things is, how much has moved to the cloud. In other words, we're focused on using tools for scanning, right? Here's all the bad CVEs, here's all the bad stuff going on, right? And why your MSP sucks, like you said. But, we've seen more, bad stuff happen with mission critical systems from misconfiguration and things in the cloud. And even the recent AWS East issue that, maybe a lot of people weren't prepared. So as we segue into reporting and feedback loop, can you also maybe talk about that? Because so much of workload doesn't exist, and traditional scanners really aren't relevant to what's driving revenue and critical business systems. So
yeah. Ryan, can I take this one real quick? Yeah. So we talked about having the business intake and understanding and asking those questions that are unexpected. But the other thing is, once you understand that, as the example I shared, 80% of the revenue comes from transaction processing fees. Really, the next step, and everybody probably sick of me saying this, but is really to draw that picture out and understand the people, process, and technology that drives that revenue. Because once you start teasing that out, you draw it on a whiteboard as people are talking, you get the right people in the room. not only, Andrew, misconfigurations in the cloud and vulnerability scanners don't catch. I lost everybody. Sorry. It's not even, the vulnerability scanners don't catch, especially the shadow IT and the stuff that people don't realize that are even there. IT, you go in you start drawing the diagram of, okay, these critical business functions drive this 80% of revenue. You start to get the people in the room and you realize, customer lists are being exported out of HubSpot and into Excel, and they put it in a Google sheet and all this other stuff. And you start mapping out these data flows, and it's like, holy crap, the data is flowing all over the place like water. And we need to understand, not just the vulnerabilities and systems we're aware of and the cloud configurations we're aware of, but teasing out the shadow IT and the people risks and the how the data flows outside the boundary that IT has no clue about. And so that's where you're not getting if you're just running the scan, you're missing all of that other, sometimes potentially even more.
Well, thank goodness we don't have to worry about shadow AI happening, Brian. But close us out. Start to talk to us.
The black box of all, the biggest black box of all time.
Start to talk to us about reporting and feedback. How you pulled it back. Now we started off with the conversation. We put in this defensible strategy that Ryan talked about. We've got all these boogeyman things, but that's the boogeyman isn't what gets results. So kind of talk to us how to make that all happen.
Yeah, I think that the findings and the reports is where MSPs need to just take a moment. Okay, take a moment. Look at the report, get excited about criticals and highs, because I can tell you, like Brian told you, I have presented to a executive team or a boardroom a report on risk, and I was all excited because it had a bunch of criticals and severity on it, and no one gave a crap about it. That's really defeating. Classic. And I know it's still happening today. It's going on every day. So I think the reporting and feedback loop, or I'll call it continuous process improvement. This is your opportunity as an MSP to take those steps to becoming strategic advisor to your customer. Now, let's not become IT guy anymore. Let's not talk about the reports. I use those report findings as the opportunity to ask the other questions that Brian's alluding to. Start to learn about how those technical findings tie back to their business outcomes and their mission. What are you protecting? Is it revenue? Is it people? Is it uptime? Is it compliance? I mean, that's usually an easy one, but tying back the actual reports, I think, to your outcomes is really what the MSPs need to stop, pause, and be thinking about. You need to think through it. And you got to show your progress over time, right? It's not about being perfect from the first moment. It's about measuring and then showing progress over time, right? This is a continuous cycle. This isn't a one-time scan. This isn't a one-time project. This isn't, hey, we ran the scan, we fixed, and we're done. That's the difference to me between vulnerability management and patch management. There's confusion there in our space. Patch management is about one time, I fixed it, it's remediated, it's done. Vulnerability management is about continuously identifying risk. And as you guys have said, this isn't a traditional environment anymore. We're seeing our attack surfaces expand every single day. Every time a brand new application comes online, every time a brand new server gets spun up in AWS, every time there's a new VM in your virtual environment, these are attack surfaces. So that continuous scan is meant to identify those assets, scan those assets, prioritize, etc. And again, I think that report feedback is the continuous education moment where you can keep making that progress with your customers. I mean, that's what it's about. Focus on improving progress, right?
So Brian, maybe close this out here, and we'll talk about just kind of how you do it with the feedback loop. How all of a sudden you'll get management go push. Well, we're not sure we want to do this, Brian. And how you pull them back to. Well, you remember when we talked about how does that go?
Yeah, you fall on your sword a little bit sometimes, right? We all held hands on and developed this policy and program. You said this was important. It's time to get out your wallet and resource this. And now you're whining about the expense. So what I generally will say is, oh, you know what? When we were putting the program and policy together, I guess, fixing and remediating some of these vulnerabilities driving 80% of your revenue isn't as important as I thought it was. I must have got that wrong. So let's go back and adjust the policy to match what you're willing to do now. So sometimes that helps, but I do want to put a quick exclamation point over Brian, because this is probably one of the more important parts we want to talk about. Is this feedback loop it's the real measure of maturity. It's my canary in the coal mine when I'm talking to an MSP about their programs, and it's the part that most of us miss. A real vulnerability management program doesn't end with the report. It starts with the report. Okay, the outcome of a scan isn't your shiny PDF that you send to your client. That's not the end, the outcome, right? It's a decision. That's what we want. Every report should loop back to leadership with four things maybe. What improved, what changed, and what's still open and why, right? That conversation keeps leadership informed, aligned on those priorities we've talked about, reinforces that security is part of the business plan and not buried under a line item under IT. So when I measure program success, these are the metrics that matter to leadership. I don't look at patch counts. I look at decision velocity, right? Because security maturity isn't about scanning faster. It's about how quickly executives act on the data that you give them. That's the metric that matters, speed to decision. So when an MSP can take that technical data, translate it into business context, and help a client make a competent, defensible, well-informed decision, that's when you've earned a seat at the table.
Well said. So Brian with an R. I'm going to put some information here in closing. We got a few minutes, and I'll just give you a minute to talk about boot camp. That it doesn't matter what scanner people are using, and that you have people can get help, and how do they reach out to you if they want to get into it?
Yeah. So if any organizations out there, want to jump into the boot camp with us, can contact us directly. Myself, it's Ryan at connectsecure.com. Real easy to remember. And for any partners that do join Andrew, part of your Write a Boom calls, we've extended a promo code. I dropped it to you in the chat. So I don't know if you want to share that out with the audience in the chat. Awesome. So yeah, that's a promo code for them. If you guys, want to take advantage of the boot camp, we're basically offering 25% off. And the way the boot camps are priced right now is you only pay for your organization, and then you can send as many people from your organization to the training. So you pay one price for your company, and you could send, 1, 5, 10, 20, 30 of your people, depending on, what that looks like. And yeah, again, the program, as much as, we try to be product ambiguous as much as possible, Connect Secure is obviously the enabling platform that we are using, but the defensibility, the alignment, the lessons we really can apply to any scanner. It doesn't have to really be a Connect Secure.
Okay. So perfect. So I put all that in chat. They can get a hold of you at Ryan at Connect Secure. We put in, the codes, and really appreciate the time for our audience. Stay, with us. And if they have any questions, Ryan, they can reach out to you. Brian, I know they can find you on LinkedIn. They can ask you anything as well. And wishing everybody a fantastic day. And gosh, hard to believe we are heading into November. So happy holidays to everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Halloween tomorrow, and make everybody make it a great day, everybody. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks all.